Okay guys, so we're starting our new unit, and this unit is all about volume. And so volume, as you may remember, is how much space a three-dimensional object takes up. And so you and I have volume because we're three-dimensional objects. Anything that's three-dimensional has a volume. And we're specifically going to be looking at three different shapes. Those shapes are going to be cylinders, cones, and spheres. So we're going to be looking at how much volume these three objects take up. So the reason that we do cylinders, cones, and spheres all together is because they have something in common. If you look at them carefully, each one of them have a circle involved in their shape. So since they all have circles involved, they all have some common themes to the way that we measure their volume. So before we start writing anything in our new packets, we kind of just need to go over quickly some key vocabulary that has to do with circles. So we're not writing anything down yet, but we want to keep this in the back of our mind. So when we talk about circles, we can talk about their radius. The radius is the distance from the center of the circle to the outer edge of the circle. So it's about half of the circle. The diameter, on the other hand, still goes through the center of the circle, but it goes straight through. So, for instance, if this circle were to have a radius of 5 centimeters, so if its radius, we use the letter R for radius, was 5 centimeters, that would mean that its diameter would have to be 10 centimeters. And if the diameter of this were 12 inches, that would tell us that the radius would have to be half of that, so 6 inches. So it's really important that we know how to get from the radius to the diameter and from the diameter to the radius. Another thing that I want to remind you of is how to find the area of a circle, because that comes into play with all of our volume shapes. So area, remember, is for two-dimensional shapes, so flat shapes. A circle is a two-dimensional shape. And an area of the circle is going to be found by doing pi r squared. So for us, we're going to always use pi as its decimal approximation, which to the nearest hundredth is 3.14. So that's what we're going to always use for pi. So say I wanted to find the area of this first circle. I would find it by doing 3.14 times 5 squared times whatever the radius squared is. If I were finding the area of the second circle, again I would use 3.14, and in this case I would want to use 6 as my radius. And then these are things that I would just type into my calculator to get a final answer. So for this first circle, if I type in 3.14 times 5 squared to my calculator, I get 78.5. And with area or volume, we're always going to be labeling it. So in this case, it would be centimeters squared. It's squared because it's a two-dimensional shape. For the second circle, the area, typing 3.14 times 6 squared into my calculator, is 113.04. We measured it in inches, and again it'll be squared because it's a two-dimensional shape. So today we're going to find the volume of a cylinder. We're still not writing anything down in our packets, but again I want us to notice that a cylinder starts off with a base of a circle. So basically all a cylinder is, and you can think of a soda can, all it is a circle that now has an added dimension of height. So basically we went from the 2D circle to a 3D cylinder, all by adding just a height. So if I'm going to find the volume of a cylinder, I'm just going to take my base and multiply it by my height. So in this case, the base of my shape is a circle, which I know has the formula of pi r squared. This is just a circle. And then all I need to do is multiply it by the height of the cylinder to get the total volume. So let's say that the radius of this is 8 meters. To find the volume, I'm going to take pi, which I'll use 3.14. I'm going to plug in 8 for my radius. And then all I need to know now is what the height is. Let's say the height is 3 meters. So I'm going to plug in 3 for my height. And if I plug this into my calculator, I get that the volume of the cylinder is going to be 602.88. And then when I label it meters. Now I'm going to label it cubed because it's a three-dimensional object. So we labeled it centimeters squared when it was a two-dimensional circle, and we label it meters cubed for a three-dimensional cylinder. So now we can flip open our packet to page 1, and we're going to find that the volume of all of these shapes have some very similar aspects. But for us, starting with a cylinder, we have no fraction, so we don't have to worry about that. We do have pi in our formula. We square our radius because that comes from our circle formula, and then we multiply the entire thing by the height. So the volume is going to be pi r squared h. That's going to be the really important formula that we use to find the volume of any cylinder. Now you need to flip over to page 6 to continue our notes. Page 6. Okay, so on page 6 we have the volume of a cylinder and we need to find it. So anytime we're doing these problems, we want to start off by identifying what we know. So in this diagram we know that the radius is 5 and that the height is 10. So I always write out my formula, V equals pi r squared h, and then I plug in what I know. I know that pi is 3.14, the radius of this cylinder is 5, and the height of this cylinder is 10. So, plugging that into my calculator, I get the volume of this shape is 785, and then I have to label it centimeters cubed. I use cubed because it's a three-dimensional object. If I look at this next one, I know that the diameter is 10, but I really need to know the radius, so I'm going to take half of that, which is 5. The height of the cylinder, they tell me, is 21. So I'm going to write out my formula, V equals pi r squared h, and I'm going to plug in what I know. I know that pi is 3.14, the radius is 5, and the height is 21. So I'm going to take my calculator and plug those values in. And so that gives me that the volume is 1,648.5 feet cubed. The last question asks me to find the height of the cylinder if I know the volume and the radius. So again, I'm going to list what I know. I know the volume is 335, and I know the radius is 5. So I'm going to take my formula, V equals pi r squared h, and I'm going to plug in what I know. I know the volume is 335. I use 3.14 for pi. I use 5 for the radius. And then what I don't know is I don't know the height. So I am going to multiply out 3.14 times 5 squared, and that's 78.5. And now I just have an algebra problem where I need to solve for h. So I'm going to divide both sides of the equation by 78.5, which gives me that the height of this cylinder is 4.27 centimeters. I don't cube it because I only cube volumes. So the big idea on this page is, first of all, you always need to write out the formula and then plug in the values that you know. The second big idea is to always make sure that you label your answer. If we're labeling a volume, we need to use a centimeters cubed because it's a three-dimensional object. If we're just finding the height, we don't put centimeters cubed because it is not a three-dimensional object. Height is not a three-dimensional object. So on the next page, I'm going to do numbers 1 and numbers 3 with you. So again, I always want to write out my formula. V equals pi r squared h. And so here, I already know the base. So they're giving me the base. Remember, the base is the formula for a circle, pi r squared. So they're telling me that pi r squared, if I multiply it together, is going to be 75. And that the height is 9 centimeters. So the volume is going to be 675 centimeters cubed because it's a three-dimensional shape. So I look over on the side and I see that P has 675 centimeters cubed, and so up at the top where I see 1, I'm going to put a P. For 3, again, I write out my formula, V equals pi r squared h, and here they're giving me the radius is 3 and the height is 5. So I'm going to plug those values into my formula. So V equals 3.14 times 3 squared times 5, which gives me that the volume is 141.3 centimeters cubed, which, if I look at my answers, corresponds with A. So anywhere I see A3, I'm going to put the letter A. So you're going to finish page 7 and 8 now.